Let's go. Hi, Professor Meares. Hi, Pedro. Hi, everyone. This is a video podcast for Post, the journal promoted by Criminal Research Center for the Study and Prevention of Crime at Miguel Hernández University. Within Post, we have a section named Post Information dedicated to current topics about social conflicts and new trends in criminology and related sciences that are discussed in social networks, but we believe that need a deep analysis. With us is Pedro Campoy, who leads this section and who will briefly explain its purpose. Pedro?
Hi, Fernando. Hi, Professor Meares. It's a great pleasure. Hi, everyone. As Fernando has mentioned, in this section, we try to understand different points of view about current topics that worry scholars, practitioners, and society. And in this sense, we think it's important to spread the expert words of academics and practitioners to make popular the knowledge. And one of the most burning issues in the last time, from both social and academic perspective, is the Black Lives Matter and the Fund the Police movement that is taking place mainly in the United States. However, here in Europe and also in Spain, we are seeing in social networks and in the media constant news about this phenomena, and we believe that is a good topic to shed some light throughout the most expert voices in it.
Well, one of these expert voices is undoubtedly Tracey Meares, a well-known professor in the field of criminal justice and criminology for many topics, and whose name will not be strange to anyone. In fact, we are sure that many of our listeners have at least read some of your work, I'm sure of that. For those of you who know her less, Professor Meares is Walton Hale Hamilton Professor and founding director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. She is internationally recognized expert on policing in urban communities and different topics in criminal law. Her research focuses on understanding how members of the public think about the relationships with legal authorities, such as police, prosecutors, and judges. And just to point out how brilliant is her work and her career, in December 2014, President Obama named her as a member of his task force on 21st century policing. So, Professor Meares, thank you very much for being here today with us. It's a total honor for us. And so let's start with some questions. For a better understanding of our audience here in space, but also in Europe, could you explain us what the Black Lives Matter movement is, and especially its historical evolution? From Europe, we can think that this movement is due to the recent events related to I Can Breathe of George Floyd, or the most recent shooting on the back of Jacob Blake, or in any case, to go back to Ferguson. Could you explain us how is related Black Lives Matter with the past, and how important these and other events have been in that evolution?
Yes, I can try anyway. Good day, everyone. I'll say good day. That's universal, and not acknowledging exactly what time zone one is in exactly. I'm really excited and honored to be invited to participate in conversation with you. So you asked me about the origins of Black Lives Matter, or as sometimes it's referred to in the US, the movement for Black Lives, to make a distinction between the specific name of organizations versus the social movement itself, right? I would say if you're talking specifically about using that term, it does have a relatively recent provenance, but not just this past summer. As you mentioned, Fernando, I would say the eruption onto the scene of that term and people talking about it happened after Ferguson, which was 5 years ago now. After Michael Brown's killing, in conjunction and in close relationship to Eric Garner's death due to a chokehold from a New York police officer, there was a series of uprisings, demonstrations, protests about the police that coalesced around this name, right? But I do think, and your question indicates this, that it's important to understand that there's a long history of that kind of protest in this country. And in fact, recently, authors, including myself, have been trying to create a through line between what we're seeing in terms of protests and uprisings today in 2020 and what we saw in the 60s, in 1968, where those demonstrations, people understand them to come under the heading of civil rights as a general matter, but I think it's really critical to understand how much of many of those demonstrations were sparked specifically by police action against individuals, not unlike what we're seeing today. So, you know, just to sum up, Movement for Black Lives, I would say most people would date the birth and the events following Michael Brown's killing 5 years ago, but with an understanding that there are definite connections between that kind of organizing that happened 5 years ago till now, and then moving back to the late 1960s, much of which was documented in the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission was enacted, was brought together precisely to discuss that phenomenon. And their primary conclusion was that the government needed to invest in these communities that had been neglected for decades before that. You know, we could look for commission to commission to commission, going back another 50 years prior to the Kerner Commission. And, you know, the differential experience that many people of color in this country have had with the COVID-19 pandemic is evidence of the failure to take the recommendations of the Kerner Commission from 1968 seriously.
Regarding the Kerner Commission, our audience may not remember this important report launched in 1968, as you point out, and it stated in page 2 that what white Americans have never fully understood, but the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. It's a harsh statement. So, from your point of view, that's still fully valid? Or is there any change today, actually?
I think that's my point of hesitation, right? I mean, it would be silly to say that literally nothing has changed since 1968. There are many facts on the ground that indicate that that's not true. Yet, it is important to understand that the basic infrastructure of that statement, I think, is true, right? And we're focusing on, let's just focus on police itself, you know, the policing as an example. Tom Tyler and I wrote recently in the Atlantic Monthly a piece that was actually translated into Spanish, I believe. I don't remember the organization that translated it, but for those of you who are watching now, I'm sure Fernando and Pedro can easily provide the Spanish translation of that piece. We have never had a sustained discussion of what police are for in this country. And yet this incredibly central institution that sends armed first responders out to address serious problems that members of the public have is just sort of allowed to grow up without a sustained discussion, set of rules, real empiricism about what it can do, what it should do, what it does do. And so you can make an argument that that happens precisely because of the statement that you made, right? So in that sense, I do think there is validity, that statement is still valid. After Kerner Commission and Kerner report began also with the seed of community policing at the start of local police funding programs to respond to community problems, different projects were launched to tackle poverty in different cities. The most famous maybe is Chicago area project, as flagship project. These programs were abandoned with the neorealism at 70s, but the investment in law enforcement was never questioned. I don't know, we have so many questions here, but who is responsible for this? The demands of the citizens of iron fist, or on the contrary, the management of different administration, or maybe both together? Yeah, you have, by asking that question, you have articulated a research agenda for a generation of scholars. I would not purport to be able to answer that in a sentence or a paragraph, but what I can do is point you to some scholars who have begun to try to answer that question, have provided different important books and responses to that question. So one response that, I think is quite compelling, although I think there are aspects of it that scholars could say, well, this part is not quite right, or, I think that part is right as only as right, but this is why it's a research agenda. But my colleague, Elizabeth Hinton, has written a magisterial book on this topic, the title of which actually refers to your question, Fernando, which is called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. She has an answer. She says, look, the Johnson administration starts out with this program that's dedicated to addressing poverty, and at least for many Black people, it morphed into an unquestioned commitment to criminal justice. So Elizabeth Hinton has one answer. My colleague and co-author Veshla Weaver, who's a political scientist at Johns Hopkins, she has some work on this that provides a different answer from the perspective of political science. It's a very important article called Front Latch, to which I recommend folks. She provides a perspective that I think is congenial to Elizabeth Hinton's, although comes from a different discipline. So answers the question quite differently, that where she talks about the role of politicians, where Elizabeth Hinton is talking about the federal administration. My colleague, James Foreman, Jr. At Yale Law School, has written a book for which he won a Pulitzer called Locking Up Our Own. And he comes at it from yet a different perspective, looking primarily at the experience, policies, approach of one place, Washington, D.C., which you might call a local perspective, right? So Elizabeth Hinton offers a perspective at the federal government level, focusing primarily on the executive. Veshla Weaver talks about political dynamics, focusing primarily on legislators and politicians. James Foreman has offered a different perspective, looking primarily at, one local entity. And I could name more, but I think the overall point is that, it takes a great deal of research from a bunch of different disciplinary perspectives in order to be able to adequately answer that question.
Yeah, you are talking now about some contributions of scholars. I'm now interested also on that role of academia on all of this. There is, now a big discussion about the role of academia, especially on policing. There are some scholars that argue that we have some responsibility on the demand of hard policing from certain sectors of population. When we research, for example, about high-risk areas, because we can spread stigmatization and fear to the public, is it possible that that kind of studies translated into the media language convey that more police are needed for these areas, and maybe police in every case we know is not the solution? So that should we stop studying concentration of crimes or hotspot policing? On the other hand, some scholars and activists are claiming to abolish the police, to defund the police, because they critically consider that the increased police activity does not ensure social protection, but in many cases can be harmful to people. But does this not obviate the problems that the abandonment by the state of some task and do not transmit to the public an idea, maybe this is too simple? I know this is not a simple question, Professor Meares, but what do you think is the role of academia and all of that? And I don't know.
That's a great question, an important question. My own view is that I think academics should take on that responsibility. But, that's personal to me. It's who I am. It also is much easier for me to say because I work in a law school where we, our job is to train professionals who are going to be doing this work and to do policy. That's what we do. So it would be silly, I think, for someone like me to say academics shouldn't care about or, shouldn't be focused front and center on that. I think people in other disciplines have, different approaches. I suppose if you're a classicist, I don't know why you should have a particular demand to do this, although from my own perspective, it would be nice. And I would find your work more interesting and relevant, to what I do. But, I don't write my own pieces to be relevant to people who are studying French. And so that they shouldn't have any obligation to do that for me. I get that. So, that's ground setting. But let me just say something on the personal and then give you a few answers to the complication part of it, where you are is this just too simple? So over my shoulder, and from in my house, it's left. I'm not sure what it looks like for you all. It's my left shoulder. You'll see a clock. That clock was owned by my grandfather, who's gone now. He gave it to me. He got it from his grandfather, and it was the very first thing that his grandfather purchased once he was emancipated. There are people in this country who purported to enslave my great-great-great-grandfather. I think I had enough greats in there. I keep this as a constant reminder of what I'm doing. I'm sitting at the back of my desk. If I turned my computer around, you could see that my desk faces that clock. And it is, for me, a reminder that my life is not my own, and I've been given many gifts. And from my own perspective, I have always been taught that I had to use those gifts to help people who weren't as fortunate as I was, especially African-American people. I'm an African-American woman, the first Black woman to be tenured at Yale Law School in 2007. So just think about that, right? So that's my articulation of my duty. What do I think we should be doing? We should be talking about exactly how complicated this is and how, and that's precisely why we should be doing it. So, for example, the calls for defunding, while important, are much more of in the words of journalist Ted Alcorn, of a compass than a map, right? Compasses just point you in the direction that you're supposed to go. We, as scholars, provide the map, right? There's nothing about defunding the police that is a map about what you should do, right? And understanding that roadmap, one has to understand very complicated, hard, history-laden conversations about the relationship that citizens as a whole have with the state, and what some groups of citizens have been denied having with the state. And then there's the whole group of people who people should think ought to be citizens who aren't, that legally, which fits in here. But the common thread in all of this is the role of the state. Now, why is that important? Because when you look at defund the police, for example, as a clarion call, it would be very easy for many state agencies to just say, okay, we're just going to take that funding away. And then what do you get? You get nothing, right? You get nothing, or you get to figure it out for yourself. There's nothing about just that phrase that talks about necessarily what a citizen is owed, and what they're owed in what context. Even moving a budget line from police to, let's say, education still doesn't give you a full articulation of what a citizen is owed in terms of how to create a safe community for a polity, right? And that's the conversation, I think, that we are critical in. And that's the conversation that I hope that those of us who understand that we're critical in also take up our obligation to participate in.
Yeah. So regarding the idea you have already mentioned about the roadmap, we have found some movements inside this big movement about abolish the police, defund the police, end of the policing, and so on. In your opinion, should we go down this road? And if not, which one could we go down? And because it seems that it's not an operational or a realistic proposal, isn't it? From our point of view, what do you think about?
I paused for a second. Sorry about that. Someone called me in the middle of this, so I turned off my microphone. So this is why I want to talk about the difference between a compass and a roadmap. I think by pointing out the fact that I believe it's a compass, then I firmly believe we should, of course, be going down this road. Yes. It's a direction that we should be pointing in. The problem is those terms mean different things to different people. And many of the people who have different views about what it means actually are not operating from the same set of facts. Right? So let me just give you a couple of examples. Defund could mean, as a start, cutting the police force in half. Something some people have described. Okay. All right. But then if you actually are an expert in that area, you know that who is on a police force, how people are let go or not, are circumscribed by a set of laws. It's circumscribed by contract. It is shaped by relationships between unions and management. It is heavily dependent on state and local budgetary concerns, which means it implicates taxing structures and obligations regarding pensions. And if you know a lot about all these things, you know a few things are going to happen. If a city agrees and could even follow through on cut the police force in half, the first people who are going to be let go are the people who are youngest, most diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and so on, and the most willing to be thinking about the job in a new way. The people who that city is obligated to keep on the force are the people who've been there the longest, are disproportionately people who have views about an older style of policing, which is not consistent with what people are interested in, and that the whole enterprise of cutting down the force is going to be weighed by the fact that a huge percentage of the budget is taken up with paying people who don't even work for the force anymore because of pensions, right? And so when you're cutting, a budget, you are basically restricting the money to paying potentially. I'm not saying that this is always true. It depends on a bunch of arrangements. You're potentially devoting your budget to paying people who not only don't even work for the force, maybe don't even live in the city or the state because they retired and they've moved to Florida, right? In the meantime, what people are asking for when they say defund is actually often more, they want to keep the new people that they want, and they want to invest in new and different programs that are more conducive to promoting safety, that don't just consist of sending armed first responders, or they want the officers who are there to be retrained and so on. And so once you understand that those are all the kinds of things that they want, you understand how there isn't necessarily a really good match between that term defund and what people want, because it could in fact require a much greater deployment of resources from the state to not only agencies outside policing, but policing itself, right? And again, to me, that's our job for thinking about what this should look like. And I will say one more thing. In my research, I have found that there's a lot to learn from the way that other countries do it. But this is in part because many other countries, especially European ones, have very robust social safety nets in the way that the United States does not, right? So again, what does it mean to talk about reimagining the police in a world in which we don't have guaranteed healthcare, we don't have good income supports, our housing policy is impoverished, right? All of those things are actual factors that are critical for how people understand safety, and also how people need to understand what it is that they want police to do, however we imagine what those agents are, right?
Professor Meares, there is some people that say that we have to differentiate between the problem with policing as a politics or the problem with the police as institution. In your big experience about these topics and your study about legitimacy and deterrence and all of these topics and policing in particular, do you believe that we can differentiate that we have a problem in each one of those or in both? Because it could be a governance issue, or it could be a policing issue. Is there any operational immediate change that we can do also and solve the problem with racial bias, managing minorities, homeless, and which is the bigger problem, or is all related?
Sorry. Let me reflect back what I think you're asking, because I'm actually unsure. But what I think I hear you saying to me is that can we solve problems simply by reforming policing as it exists today?
Or we have to also go to the institution itself?
Right. Yeah. So I absolutely think there are things we can do today to make what happens today better and less harmful. Absolutely, right? So my own research shows that procedural justice training for police officers themselves can reduce the number of complaints that members of the public issue, can actually reduce incidents of physical police abuse. This is a study a Justice Collaboratory study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So, we know there are things you can do now, yes. But I don't think, I think it's a false choice to say that we should do those things and not really take on this important question. And I'll say, even when I was on the president's task force 5 years ago, there are some critics of that report who say, they were just proposing reforms around the edges. It's kind of setting up the choice that you mentioned. It's the difference between reforms versus abolition. That's a distinction that I actually reject, because if the idea of the people who think about abolition is that there is only one way to do this, I disagree. Right? I think there are lots of on-ramps, and the work, I actually have the report right here. We acknowledge in the report, so I'm going to follow Pedro's example by reading a bit from the report. But, the President's Task Force made two overarching recommendations, one of which is that the President should support and provide funding for a national crime and justice task force to review and evaluate all components of the criminal justice system for the purpose of making recommendations to the country on comprehensive reform. That was one overall suggestion. Comprehensive reform means, like, maybe we need to really rethink this whole thing. And then overarching recommendation number 2 is the President should promote programs and take a comprehensive and inclusive look at community-based initiatives that address core issues of poverty, education, health, and safety. I mean, right? So within this document, there are these things we can do now, or the kinds of things that you were talking about on policing, in the context of acknowledging that for this to really work, we have to do something much bigger than that.
But, it seems that those politics have been abandoned by the actual administration, because it looks like you are more focused in law and order than social politics, health system, and could be because of this. Some activists are defending that we cannot improve the management, because from their point of view, this data you have managed to do these recommendations, it's bad or it's flawed. Do you agree with this activist within this idea that your data for your recommendations have no sense, or is flawed, is about data? What's your opinion about these statements?
I think it's incredibly difficult to talk about policing as one monolithic thing in this country, even though there are sort of overarching statements you can make, right? So, I don't want to be called a hypocrite. And when I say, policing in this country is too violent, I think that is uncontrovertibly true, right? too much force is used overall. That does not mean that every policing agency in the country does that work in exactly the same way and is at exactly the same level of failure, right? And it's because we have a federalist system that I think I can make the claim that I made to Fernando, that it is possible to have improvements in different places. And also, one can say that unless we're going to have wholesale change of this entire enterprise, those improvements are not going to get us to the place where most people, including me, think we should be. I don't know if you find that an adequate or satisfying answer, Pedro, but I think one thing that might be really hard for your viewers to understand is that there are 17,000 policing agencies in this country, maybe even more, that have their own jurisdiction, their own rules, that are not responsible to any federal baseline rules except for the Constitution. And even then, when there's, they are not automatically called into question for their violations of the Constitution unless those violations reach a pattern and practice of consistent constitutional violations such that the agency is investigated by the federal government. That's very different from, let's say, in the UK, a system that I know the best, where the Home Office regularly audits policing agencies because every policing agency is actually responsible to the national government. It's not like that here. So anytime you make a blanket statement, you're making it, or you should be making it cognizant of the fact that even within a particular jurisdiction, let's say a big city, you're going to have multiple different agencies that are doing different things with different levels of success, right? You're going to have like the city policing agency, and then you might have the subway policing agency, and then you might have a school policing agency, and then you might have 3 universities that have their own policing agencies, right? That's what it looks like here.
Very complex, yeah.
Yeah. I have a big doubt now because I have 2 questions. I don't want to I don't know if I can make both, but I will try. First question is if you believe this is interesting for European study of policing. So we can see that this is an American problem, but also I believe that there is something we can learn from all of this. And what do you believe we as academics also, and the people that is viewing this can learn from this problem that, of course, is a problem specifically of policing in America, but also is an issue that is concerns different topics that also are related with us. And the other question I wanted to point out is in my case, also, I'm very interested in legitimacy and all of this in both a substantive and procedural sense, all that you and other authors have worked on in academic literature. But the application of all of these ideas at least depends on politicians abandoning certain discourses and certain politics, law and order politics, and adopting approaches that are more compatible with procedural legitimacy. Do you think this change at the end, as you have seen in your career, is possible? Do you think the shift to better policing in the United States, also in Europe, at the end is possible?
Yeah, okay. So with respect to your first question, one of the things that I think that you all, people not in the US, can learn from our experience excluding the governance problems that are associated with the federalist system. If we're just talking about the dynamics of policing people differently, and of course, people in European countries can learn from this, because the experience that we have in the US concerning the relationship that law enforcement agents have with people of color in this country, but in particular, Black people who, and our very particular history of chattel slavery is reflected in Europe by imperialism and colonialism, of course. And so to the extent that especially citizens of former colonies come to European countries, and it creates dynamics. I know this better for France than I do for Spain, but and or Germany, but France in particular. Our experience is reflected in those dynamics, and I learn a lot from reading, researchers, let's say like Sophie Baudy-Gendreau. Her work is helpful for me in understanding the kinds of things that I'm trying to understand in our own context, right? So I think that's an answer to the first question. With respect to, whether I think, we can achieve this ultimate goal, one thing I can say is the shift from policing that focuses on reduction of crime by essentially any means necessary, which was definitely the dominant approach to policing, let's say 10 to 15 years ago, has shifted here. And, if you want to talk about what researchers and academics can do, I think it is fair to say that Tom Tyler and I played a pretty large role in shifting that conversation. I'm not saying that police executives uniformly believe that trust and legitimacy and procedural justice should be central, but many of the most important ones do. And, that would not have happened if our research didn't exist, if we didn't have an opportunity to play a central role, for example, the role that I played on the President's Task Force. The tougher question, Fernando, I think, is whether pushing forward a different orientation, right? Moving from this outcome-oriented, deterrence-based, get tough approach to an approach that makes central trust, legitimacy, relationships between legal authorities and the citizens they serve. Your question is like, can you really embrace that so that there is a real fundamental change, which could ultimately result in the destruction of what you do as you know it, which is what I want it to do. Can they contemplate that? I think some can. I think it's harder for others, not surprisingly. I think it will take time. The first shift took time, took a decade. I don't expect the next shift to happen in 2 or 3 years, which I think gets back to Pedro's question about, what activists expect, what they are willing, it's their job to not be patient. That's their job. And it is my job to research, document, and be careful, which is not the same thing as saying I'm patient. It's just a way of saying I'm going to do what I do, and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, which means it's not going to happen on a dime. Because if it would happen on a dime, then I'm not being the academic, a credible academic. So I don't know if that's satisfying as an answer, but that's what I've got.
Sounds perfect. It's what we have to do. So thank you, Tracey. I don't know if Pedro, do you have any last question?
I could be talking with you both all the 2
was a
hours
very
more, but I think we are on time.
Be safe with the new course, with the new year, and okay, keep in touch. And thank you a lot for your
Thank you very much.
participation in this conversation. Thank you.